The rustling behind the wall began at midnight, soft but insistent, like someone scraping fingernails on wood. Eric Kowalski sat in his small room on the ground floor of the Kronheim building, his fingers wrapped around a mug of cold tea, his eyes staring into space. He knew the sound. Old houses always creak, but this was different, alive, like a whisper that wanted to be heard. Eric stood up, his boots creaking on the linoleum, and walked over to the wall, pressing his ear to the cold plaster. The rustling died away, but his heart was pounding, like those nights in prison when he waited for the blow. "You're paranoid," he told himself, but the voice in his head, his own but rusty as a knife, answered, "Or someone knows you're here." The Kronheim building had never been a comfortable place. Its cracked walls smelled of damp and old tobacco, and the stairs creaked as if they were complaining about everyone who walked on them. Eric had been working as a concierge for 6 months now, but he still felt like an outsider. The tenants were reserved and suspicious, and they said little, and Eric dismissed the rumors about the building, that it held those who had died, especially on the 3rd floor, as nonsense. But this morning, Anna Weber, a lonely pensioner from the 3rd floor, was found dead in her apartment. The police said it was a heart attack, but Eric had seen her body while helping the paramedics. The bruises on her wrists, dark as ink, were not from old age. He climbed to the 3rd floor, his flashlight illuminating the narrow hallway where the lights flickered like sore eyes. Anna's door was ajar, though the police had left an hour ago. Eric stepped inside, his nostrils catching the scent of medicine and something else, metallic, like blood. He examined the lock. Scratches on the frame, thin but fresh, as if someone had picked the door with a master key. His criminal past, car thefts, dark nights in garages, had taught him to notice such marks. This isn't just death, he thought, and a voice in his head added, "You know what murder smells like. You've seen it." Eric pushed away the memory of his friend, of the night it had all gone wrong, and his stomach clenched. He returned to the closet, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty entryway. The mirror in the hall, old and stained, reflected his face, pale, with shadows under his eyes that seemed deeper than in the morning. For a split second, it seemed to him that it was not he in the mirror, but Lucas, his friend, whose blood remained on his conscience. Lucas looked, his lips moved, but there was no sound. Eric blinked, and the reflection became his, but the cold in his chest remained. "You are going crazy," he said to himself, but the voice answered, "Or the house wants you to see." That night the rustling came back, louder, closer, as if someone was standing behind the wall. Eric turned on the light, his hand shaking, but the closet was empty. He went to the door, his fingers touched the handle, and suddenly the light flickered. In the darkness he heard footsteps, slow, heavy, as if someone was coming down from the 3rd floor. Eric opened the door, his flashlight illuminating the empty hallway, but the smell of blood, the same as in Anna's apartment, hit his nostrils. He stepped back, his breath ragged, and a voice in his head poisonous as smoke, said, "This is not just death. It is a warning, and it is for you." Eric closed the door, his fingers tightening on the knife he kept under the table, and he knew he could not just wait. The Kronheim house looked at him, its walls breathing, and Eric felt that the third floor had already chosen the next one. The moon hung over the city like a cracked lantern, its light barely filtering through the curtains of the first floor of the Kronheim house. Since the night when Eric Kowalski first heard rustling sounds behind the wall, thin as a rat's claws, but insistent as a pulse, he could no longer trust the silence. The first chapter of his life in this house had ended with the disappearance of Anna Weber, whose apartment now stood empty but smelled of blood, as if the walls had absorbed her last breath. He had thought it was an accident, that her death was just another crack in the old foundation of his mind, but now, sitting in his closet, he felt the house watching him. His fingers fiddled with the coin, cold and smooth, found in the pocket of Lucas, the boy who had disappeared before Anna. The coin was the only thing that connected them all, and Eric couldn't help but think that it was the key, even though the lock remained invisible. Morning came with the news of Mikael Lund. The ex-soldier, as strong as oak, lay dead on the third floor. The police had given up on it, an overdose, they said, but Eric knew better. He'd seen his body when he helped the paramedics, his skin pale, not from the cold but from something that had sucked the life out of him. The puncture marks on his arm were too neat, too surgical, to be the work of a drug addict. Eric had snuck into Mikael's apartment later after the cops had left, his flashlight picking out the stains on the floor and the sweet smell that hung in the air like spoiled honey. This was not suicide. This was the work of a professional, and Eric, whose nights in the underworld had taught him to read such signs, could feel the chill creeping under his skin. Someone in this building was killing, and doing it with cold precision. He returned to his room, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The mirror in the hall, stained with time, showed him his face, exhausted, his eyes lost in shadows. For a moment it seemed to him that it was not he, but Mikael looking out of the glass, his gaze empty, like a puppet with its strings cut. Eric shook his head. The reflection returned to normal, but his heart was pounding like a drum. He sat down at the table, took out a notebook and began to write. The bruises on Anna's body, Mikael's injections, Lucas's coin. It all fit together, but the picture eluded him. Why this house? Why these people? And why did he himself feel that the next move was his? A knock on the door broke the silence. Eric grabbed the knife hidden under the table and opened it. Clara Nielsen, a student from the third floor, stood there, her face chalk white, her eyes shining with tears. "I heard sounds," she whispered, her voice shaking like a string. "In the walls, and that smell, like Anna's." Eric nodded, his throat tightening. He wanted to say that it was just an old house, that the creaking and dampness were its nature, but the words stuck. He walked her to her apartment, the light from the flashlight dancing on the walls where the lamps flickered like dying stars. He noticed scratches near her door, fresh, thin, as if someone had drawn a blade. They were the same as Anna's. Eric clenched his fists. Someone or something was playing with them, and he knew that Clara was next on the list. Night fell on the Kronheim like a heavy blanket. The rustling noises returned, louder, closer, as if someone was breathing behind the wall. Eric turned on the light, but the room was empty. He went to the door, his hand shaking on the handle, and suddenly the light flickered. Footsteps sounded in the darkness, heavy, slow, descending from the 3rd floor. He swung the door open, the flashlight illuminating the corridor, but there was no one there. Only the smell of blood, sharp and thick, hit him in the face like a slap. Eric stepped back, closed the door, clutching the knife so hard that his knuckles turned white. The house was alive, breathing, and its walls whispered threats. He realized that he could not wait any longer. The 3rd floor was calling to him, and Eric knew that there in the shadows lay the answer, or the end. He put on his old jacket, put the coin in his pocket, and picked up the flashlight. As he climbed the stairs, he felt the air thicken, as if the house was trying to stop him. The 3rd floor was quiet, but the silence was alive, tense, like a tote string. Mikhail's door was ajar, although he clearly remembered closing it. Eric stepped inside, and the light from the flashlight fell on the floor, where another coin lay, just like his, cold and shiny. He bent down to pick it up, and at that moment he heard a rustling sound, not from the wall but from behind him. Turning, he saw a shadow, tall and still, standing in the doorway. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed in the darkness like coals. Eric froze, the knife fell from his hand, and a voice in his head, no longer his but someone else's, said, "You brought it back. Now you are ours." The coin in his pocket became warm, almost scalding, and Eric realized that the first chapter was just the beginning, and the second was no longer his story. It was the story of the house, and he, like everyone else who stepped here, had become a part of it. The shadow stepped forward, and the light from the flashlight went out. Eric Kowalski stood before the door to the 3rd floor, the knife in his hand reflecting the dim light of the flickering lights. The cold air from under the crack smelled damp and metallic, like the blood that had trickled down Clara's windowsill. He clutched the list of names he had found in the basement, the paper rustling in his pocket. A reminder that his own name had been crossed out, but not written out of the game. Kronheim House breathed around him, the walls creaking as if to match the rhythm of his footsteps, and the mirrors in the hallway reflected shadows that shouldn't have been there. He pushed, opened the door to Clara's apartment, the police tape already hanging down, torn by the wind from the open window. Inside, chaos reigned. Books were strewn about as if after a fight. The glass of a broken vase crunched underfoot. Eric went to the window, where the scratches on the sill still bore traces of a struggle. He ran his finger over the blood. It had dried, but the smell remained, sweet and sickening, like Mikhail's before his end. They took her, he thought, and the house rustled behind the wall as if in agreement, Clara's diary lay on the floor, open to the last page. Eric picked it up and reread the lines. He came. I saw his shadow. He wants to take me away. The handwriting trembled, the letters merging as if she were writing in the dark, hearing footsteps. He turned the page back and froze. There was a drawing, crude, hastily sketched in charcoal. A faceless figure, long fingers reaching for a window. Under the drawing, one word. Concierge. Eric dropped the diary, his heart pounding. She knew, or thought she knew. He went down to his cubicle, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The coin he had found on Mikael was still lying on the table, its surface shining like an eye watching him. Eric picked it up, held it up to the light. There was a symbol etched on it, barely visible, 3 intersecting lines, like claws. He remembered the basement, the syringes, the scalpels, the blood bags. This wasn't just a gang. This was a ritual. And the house, this damned Kronheim, wasn't just a place. It was part of a plan. The night brought a knock. At first soft, then insistent, as if someone was scratching at the door. Eric grabbed the knife, his breath hitching, but he forced himself to open it. There was no one behind the threshold, only a shadow flickering at the end of the hallway and a whisper. You're ours. He rushed after her, but the shadow disappeared at the stairs to the 3rd floor. Eric stood up, his steps slowing near Clara's apartment. The window was closed, the curtains hung motionless. But on the glass, from the inside, words appeared, written with a finger. You're next. He stepped back, the knife falling from his hands, clanking on the floor. The voice of the house grew louder, filling his head. You won't leave. You're part of us. Eric grabbed the coin, squeezed it until his palm hurt, and ran toward the basement. The answers were there, in the hiding place, on the list, in the blood. He didn't know how much time he had, but he knew one thing. The 3rd floor was waiting for him, and this time he wouldn't go there alone. Lucas, whose reflection he'd seen in the mirror, followed him, silent and dead, like a shadow of the past that couldn't be shaken off. The rain was pouring down, turning the streets into black rivers where the reflections of the streetlights trembled like ghosts. Detective Marcus Blackwood walked down a narrow alley, his boots splashing in puddles, the collar of his coat turned up to protect his face from the cold drops. He was chasing a shadow, a figure that had flickered at the end of the street and disappeared around the corner. It was his only lead in a case that had already claimed 3 lives, and Marcus was not about to lose it. The night was thick as ink, and only occasional flashes of lightning revealed the outlines of buildings, like the skeletons of a long-forgotten city. The alley led him to an abandoned warehouse, its windows as empty as the eye sockets of a skull. The door was ajar, and from within came a soft rustling sound, as if something were moving in the darkness. Marcus drew his revolver, his fingers tightening around the cold handle, and stepped inside. The smell of mold and dampness assaulted his nose, and broken glass crunched under his feet. He switched on his flashlight, the beam illuminating rusty shelves and boxes covered in dust. Something moved in the far corner. Marcus's heart began to beat faster, but he forced himself to breathe evenly as he had been taught at the academy. It was his rule, never to show fear, even when his insides were clenched with anticipation. "Come out, I see you," he said, his voice muffled like a gunshot through cotton wool. The shadow in the corner froze, then turned slowly. Marcus pointed the flashlight at it, and his breath caught in his throat. A man stood before him, his face hidden by a hood, but his eyes glittered in the light like a cornered animal. "Don't move," Marcus shouted, raising his gun. The man raised his hands, but his lips were twisted in a smile that made Marcus's skin crawl. It was a smile as familiar as an old scar that aches before the rain. "Long time no see, Marcus," the man said, pulling back his hood. Beneath it was a face Marcus hadn't seen in 10 years, his brother, Jake, missing since the night there. Family had fallen apart. Marcus lowered the gun, his hand shaking like a leaf in the wind. "Jake, is that you?" he whispered. But the question hung in the air, unnecessary and stupid. There he was, older, with scars crisscrossing his cheek, like cracks in the pavement, but with the same eyes, full of pain and rage, that Marcus had seen in his nightmares. "You thought I was dead, huh?" Jake stepped forward, his boots scraping against the glass, the sound cutting through Marcus like a knife. "But I'm alive, brother, and I know who killed those people. I know because it was me." Marcus stepped back, his back against the bookcase, the metal cold cutting into his bones. "No, you couldn't," he managed, but his voice was hesitant, like a man standing on the edge of a precipice and afraid to look down. Jake laughed, a dry, ragged sound like burning wood. "You've always been blind, Marcus. Never seen what was happening right under your nose, but now you have to open your eyes." He pulled a stack of photographs from his pocket and tossed them at Marcus's feet. Marcus leaned over and picked one up. It was the first man he'd killed, his eyes wide and a brand of a crossed-out 8 burned into his forehead. Marcus had seen that brand before, on all 3 victims. But now it stared back at him from the photograph, alive. "These aren't just murders," Jake said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "They're a message, and you're part of it." Marcus looked up, his mind racing like rats in a burning house. "What do you want from me?" he asked, clutching the photograph so tightly the paper creaked. Jake stepped closer, his breath hot as steam over boiling water. "I want you to remember. Remember the night you betrayed me. Remember how you left me to die." Marcus shook his head, his memory as hazy as the rain-streaked streets outside. I don't remember," he said. But Jake grabbed him by the collar and pulled him close, their faces inches apart. "You remember, Marcus, and you're going to pay for it." At that moment, the light from the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into complete darkness. Marcus heard a rustling sound, and then a sharp thud as something heavy fell on his head, and he collapsed to the floor, losing consciousness. The last thing he saw were Jake's eyes, burning with hatred, and a shadow behind him, a tall figure whose face was hidden in the darkness. Who was it? Jake's ally? Or someone who was watching them both? Marcus woke to the cold, penetrating his soaked coat. His head was splitting, and there was a metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He was lying on the warehouse floor, his flashlight lying next to him, its light as weak as the breath of a dying man. Marcus stood up, his legs shaking, but he forced himself to move. Jake was gone, and so was the shadow, but one of the photographs remained on the floor. Marcus picked it up. This time it was of himself with the same brand on his forehead as the victims. The caption read, "You're next." He stepped outside, the rain still pouring down, washing away traces as if the city had never been touched by this night. Marcus stood under a street lamp, his raincoat soaking wet, his head spinning with questions. Jake was alive. Jake was a killer. Or was he? Something in his words, in his eyes, made Marcus unsure. And that shadow behind his brother. Who was it? And why was the memory of that night Jake spoke of so fuzzy, like a reflection in murky water? He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, leaving red crescents. A voice inside him whispered, "This isn't the end, Marcus. This is just the beginning." He knew he had to find Jake, had to understand what had happened 10 years ago and who was behind it all. But now he wasn't sure if he was searching for the truth or just trying to survive. The rain pounded the asphalt, the streetlight flickering, casting long shadows that seemed alive. Marcus took out a cigarette, but the matches were wet and he threw them into a puddle. "The hell with it," he muttered, and walked forward, into the night, where answers awaited him, or death, or both. The rain continued to fall, turning the city into a blur of shadow and water. Marcus Blackwood stood on the edge of an abandoned warehouse roof, looking down at the black rivers of streets, swallowing up the last of the light. He clutched a photograph in his hand, the one with his face and the brand of the crossed-out 8. The caption, "You're next," no longer seemed a threat, but an inevitability. Jake was gone, vanishing into the night like smoke, but his words still burned Marcus like embers smoldering beneath his skin. He found his brother 2 days after that meeting in the warehouse. The trail led him to the old family home, the place where it all began and, Marcus now realized, would end. The house stood alone, slanted, its windows broken, its walls covered in mold, as if time itself had decided to wipe it off the face of the earth. It was silent inside, only the creak of the floorboards underfoot breaking the deathly silence. Marcus walked with a revolver in his hand, each step echoing in the emptiness of his chest. Jake was waiting for him in the basement. The light from a single bulb swinging on a wire picked him out of the darkness. He stood by a wall where names were carved into the bricks, dozens of them, burned and crossed out like a list of sins. Tools lay nearby, knives, brands, jars of some kind of acrid liquid that made the air smell of death. "You came," Jake said without turning around. "I knew you couldn't stay away." His voice was empty, like a burnt-out forest. Marcus lowered the gun. "Why, Jake? Why all this?" he asked, but the answer no longer mattered. Jake turned, his face as grey as ash, his eyes dull, as if he had long since ceased to be human. "You betrayed me," he said. 10 years ago you left me in that fire. I survived, but they made me this." He pointed to the scars, to his hands, black with soot and blood. They, the word hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. "Who are they?" Marcus managed, but Jake only laughed, and his laugh sounded like ripping paper. "You still don't see," he said, stepping closer. "These aren't just killings. This is a ritual, and you are the last piece." He pulled the knife from his belt, but Marcus was faster. A shot rang out in the basement, and Jake fell to his knees, blood pouring from his chest, staining the floor in a crimson stain. But it wasn't over. A shadow appeared from the corner, the same one Marcus had seen in the warehouse. A tall figure in black, face hidden by a hood. She didn't say a word, only raised her hand, and Marcus felt a chill grip his body. The gun fell from his fingers, his legs buckled. The shadow walked up to Jake, bent down, and Jake, choking on blood, whispered, "Do it! Finish it!" Marcus screamed, but his voice was lost in the silence. The shadow turned to him, and beneath the hood he saw not a face, but emptiness, black and endless as the night itself. The brand flashed in its hand, red hot. The last thing Marcus felt was a searing pain on his forehead, and then the world went out like a light bulb burning out from the strain. In the morning, the rain stopped. The city woke up not knowing what had happened in the old house on the outskirts. The bodies of Marcus and Jake were found a week later when a neighbor complained about the smell. On their foreheads were identical brands, crossed out 8s, burned with such precision that it seemed that they were not made by a person. The police closed the case, blaming it on a serial killer who had long since disappeared into the shadows. But that night, when the rain washed away the last traces, someone saw a tall figure in black standing under a street lamp. She was holding a stack of photographs, and on the top was a new picture, the face of the next victim with the caption, "You're next." The city went on, blind and deaf to the fact that the darkness had already chosen its target. And somewhere in the basements, under a layer of ash and forgotten names, the ritual was waiting for its time.